Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. Today I'm happy to show off this device here. This is an original Game Boy Advance running on a CM4 board. They're calling it the G4A. Now this is a special project that was just released on Kickstarter yesterday, and it's made by Eddie over at myretrogamecase.com. And I've previously featured other mod kits and devices that he's shown off before, but I find this one very special. It's one of the first CM4 handhelds to hit the market, and it has some really neat features to it, like having the firmware card stored inside of a Game Boy Advance cartridge. And it uses rechargeable batteries in their original housing. Now even with just one day into the Kickstarter campaign, they've already doubled their goal, which is really awesome to see because I think this is a really neat project. And on their Kickstarter page, they've got a lot of good history here and talking about why they're making this device in the first place. And they're releasing several different types of kits. For example, you can buy a do-it-yourself kit for 135 Singaporean dollars, which is about $100 US. And with this one, you'll be able to use your original Game Boy Advance case, and then bring your own CM4 module as well. Now for a little bit more, for $167 US, you can actually just get a pre-made kit, and that's the one I'm going to test here in this video. This one is pre-assembled and ready to play right out of the gate. And these are shipping as early as December, and the second batch will be available in January. So I think it's really neat. You know, the people who want to start their own project and put something together themselves, they can do that. Or if you want someone else to make it for you, you've got that option too. And like I mentioned before, the firmware card is actually within a cartridge. And this is a really neat concept here, because in addition to having your firmware SD card really easily accessible, he also ported over the Wi-Fi module onto this board as well. This is a great idea because the Wi-Fi board causes a lot of heat, and now it's not going to affect the CM4 board itself. And with Raspberry Pi, heat is a really big issue, so in that sense, this is a pretty cool idea. And speaking of firmware, there are a lot of options available already. Right now, there's already RetroPie, Laka, and RetroArena working, and we're likely going to see firmwares from Batocera and Recalbox as well. So by the time this device starts shipping, I expect to see about 5 different firmwares available. And that's one of the nice things about this device being based on a Raspberry Pi module, because all these years of firmware development give this device a head start. Now that being said, the firmware is not mature on any of these yet, so I'm going to show you the best performance I was able to get, but I would expect to see improvements over the coming months. So yeah, in today's video, I'm going to show you all sorts of things about this device to give you an idea of whether or not this is a good fit for you, because I don't think this device is for everyone. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. So I'm not going to show off a lot when it comes to unboxing. I do think you're probably going to have a different experience when these actually ship. But in my pack, I did get a USB link cable, more on that here in a minute. Then I also got this little bamboo display case. I think the people who pledge for the early bird packages are going to get this as well. Anyway, here's the device. So yeah, probably the first thing you're noticing are these colorful buttons, and I specifically asked for these because I thought it would be pretty neat looking. And I'm sure there's going to be some color options available when you place your order or when they start preparing it for shipping. Overall, I think the device stays true to the original hardware. There were a few necessary tweaks, and I'll get into more detail with that in a few minutes, but probably the one that's going to stick out the most are the L2 and R2 buttons here on the back. But before we get into too much detail about the buttons and the screen and things like that, let's talk a little bit more about these cartridges. There are 2 different cartridges available, and you'll get both of them if you order the pre-assembled kit. Now one of the cartridges comes with no Wi-Fi module at all, it's just the SD card. This one will be nice in case you want to, for example, save on battery life, or you really just want to keep your device offline. By contrast, the other one has a Wi-Fi module, but it's not required to be on all the time. Let me show you how this works. So you put the Wi-Fi module case inside, and then you hold down the select button, and then turn the power on. And you can verify that the Wi-Fi chip is on by the red light you can see coming out of the cartridge. Now the thing about Raspberry Pis in general is they take a while to boot, and on top of that they don't have a sleep mode. So that's something to think about if you are going to pick up this handheld, is that it's not a pick up and play device. As you can see here, it takes nearly a minute to actually get from the moment you turn on the device to actually navigating through the menu. So it will definitely require some patience. Now most of these firmwares use an emulation station front end, so you're probably familiar with this if you've seen any of my other videos. For the most part, you can pick your system, then navigate through your games. And you can scrape your media and all the other stuff that you would expect. So let's talk a little bit about charging and battery life. I would expect about 2.5 hours of gameplay from these batteries here. And charging on the device is actually done through the link cable. You would plug this in and charge the batteries that are already inside. But I'd actually recommend an independent battery charger. You can pick up something like this for $12 and it'll even include batteries. And I'll leave a link to the one that I bought here in the video description. But yeah, I think this is a much better solution because you can have batteries charging while you're playing. And so essentially you can just replace the batteries when they run low, just like back in the day. And they're so easy to swap out, just like old regular AA batteries. And so in my opinion, despite the fact that they only last about 2.5 hours, this is a really handy solution to be able to play for extended periods. Okay, so now let's talk about buttons and things like that. Now this is original hardware, so this is the original Game Boy Advance D-pad, for better or for worse. It's pretty mushy, not a lot of pivot, but that's how they used to be back in the day. Now this analog stick was not originally on the hardware, this is a PS Vita analog stick, and it works just fine. It's got just enough room to fully maneuver. And I think the metal rim around the outside is a nice touch. Now these are the original start and select buttons, so they're very mushy feeling. But you're probably not going to push them that much. Now let's talk about face buttons. First thing you'll notice is they're kind of a little bit cramped. Now this is a handmade device, made by one person, and so there's going to be imperfections. For example, with my green button, it's not perfectly straight. It doesn't actually affect gameplay at all, but just be aware that these are the kind of things that can happen with a handmade device like this. So talking about the feel of the buttons here, they're mushy but responsive. In general, these are good buttons. Comparatively, the D-pad takes a lot more pressure to push down on. Like I mentioned before, it is mushy. Now these original shoulder buttons have never been the best, but they are functional. They don't have a lot of travel, but they're kind of meant to be mashed down on. And in that sense, they work. Now these L2 and R2 buttons were added after the fact, and I'm not a huge fan of them. They're pretty small and kind of hard to get to. Now honestly, there's not a lot of space to work with, but I found that I would map the buttons so I didn't have to push those ones. In general, I treat these like hotkeys, but not actual buttons that I would push when playing a game. Now along the bottom, everything is the same as it was originally. You have your on and off switch, headphone jack, and a volume rocker. And for the most part, the rest of the case is identical to what you would expect from the original Game Boy Advance. Probably the only other thing that really sticks out is this little screw here. And as Eddie explains in the Kickstarter page, this screw was necessary in order to tighten up the housing after adding the PS Vita analog stick. So it does stick out a little bit like a sore thumb, but honestly you never really see it unless you're actually looking for it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the screen now. This is a 3-inch display, 640 by 480p, and OCA laminated. And it's a really nice display. The viewing angles are pretty good, they get a little bit washed out, but other than that, this screen is very good. Now, Eddie over at My Retro Game Case has been modding devices for years now. And earlier in this year, he sent me over the CM3 version of this Game Boy Advance. So this one is the predecessor to the one we're testing today. This has a Raspberry Pi 3 module inside of it. And besides the processor, one of the main differences of this older one is that it used a 3.5-inch display instead of a 3-inch display. And while the bigger screen definitely gives more of a wow factor when you first pick it up, I actually like the 3-inch one better. For starters, the 3-inch display actually looks a lot better than the bigger one. But on top of that, it just seems more fitting with the body itself. It has more of that original hardware feel to it. Now, speaking of hardware, I'm not going to do a full teardown, partially because I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to break something when I tear it apart. But luckily, ETA Prime already did a teardown in his testing video, so I would check out his video. I'll leave it linked in my description. So what I really want to focus on here is some of the options you're going to have available when it comes to software and the performance potential that I see in this device. The first thing I want to emphasize is that none of these firmwares are mature yet. For example, when using the RetroPie firmware, I found that Nintendo and Super Nintendo games had significant amounts of screen tearing. Now obviously this device and this display are more than capable of playing Nintendo games without any screen tearing, which just means that this firmware has not been optimized yet for this hardware. But luckily you're not limited to just this firmware. One other option is Laka, which already has a build specifically for this device. And if you're not familiar with Laka already, it is a firmware that is exclusively RetroArch, so it's basically like just booting into RetroArch itself. And as you can see with this, it doesn't have any of those screen tearing issues with this firmware, which leads me to think that it's just a configuration that needs to be made in RetroPie. And the other firmware that's currently working on this device is the Retro Arena. Now this firmware is found on nearly 50 different devices at this point, and one of the biggest strengths of the Retro Arena is the sheer amount of systems that it supports. And Steve, who is the developer of Retro Arena, has only had this device for 2 days, and he's already gotten nearly 100 systems working on it. That's pretty amazing. And just like with Laka, this one doesn't have any of those screen tearing issues either. And so far I found that the Retro Arena is definitely the most mature of these firmwares, and that's the one that I've been using the most. Okay, so let me walk you through some of the performance I've seen on various firmwares, and I'm just going to show them off at random, but I'm going to typically find the ones that work the best. When it comes to Super Nintendo emulation, all 3 of these firmwares work just fine. I don't think we're going to have any problems with Super Nintendo on this system. Nintendo 64 was hit and miss. For the most part, all three firmwares seem to have about the same performance. And that is that any of your medium to lower end Nintendo 64 games seem to play really well. But when you start to get to the harder games like Mario Tennis or Killer Instinct Gold, you're definitely going to see some slowdown. And while some games like Mario Tennis are definitely playable, I found that Killer Instinct Gold was way too slow, and same thing with things like Cruisin' USA. This one would have pockets of performance that were really good, but then also have these moments of incredible slowdown. So I hope that some of these emulators are going to get optimized over time, but for now I'm not confident in saying that every Nintendo 64 game is going to play perfectly. When it comes to arcade emulation, the performance is pretty good. A lot of the games that you would expect to play at full speed will play at full speed, things like Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter 3. A lot of these games from the mid to late 90s seem to work okay. Of course, the ones that are always hard to emulate, like Killer Instinct, still have problems, but I would say the performance on this is definitely better than something on the RK3326. Moving over to Sega Saturn, the only firmware that had any decent Saturn performance was the Retro Arena, and that's because it was the only one that had the Yabasan Shiro core. And even on this core, the games weren't playing at full speed, but they were pretty close. One of the nicer things about this performance is despite the fact that it was slow, the sound itself was not stuttering or crackling in any way, which definitely makes it a lot more bearable. And I would say the medium to easy games to play on Saturn play just fine. Things like Sonic 3D looked really good. Now it looks like Dreamcast performance is a little bit of a work in progress for some of these other firmwares. For example, there was a good amount of slowdown in Sonic Adventure on RetroPie. And Dreamcast was even worse on Laka. Even though the performance was pretty good, there were a lot of pauses and freezes, to the point where the game would freeze sometimes. But luckily, the Retro Arena has Redream, and it works really well. For the most part, every Dreamcast game that I played on Retro Arena using Redream played at full speed or very close to that. So I'm pretty confident in saying that almost every Dreamcast game is going to play really well on this system. Now at this point, PSP is a bit of a mixed bag. Not a lot of games are playing at full speed, but a lot of them played very close to it. And because we're working with a 3-inch screen here, it actually doesn't look bad when you just use the native resolution, which is what I'm using here with 0 frame skip. But once you get into some of those harder games like Outrun or God of War, they definitely cannot play at full speed unless you use some frame skip. Here on Outrun 2006, I'm not using any frame skip at all, 1x resolution, and it can definitely not keep up. Now finally, one thing I want to talk about with the RetroPie image is that it supports GameCube emulation. And even some of the promotion materials I've seen for this G4A have shown GameCube gameplay. But let me just take a minute here and temper those expectations. I will say that yes, it plays cutscenes from GameCube really well, but the gameplay itself is nowhere near playable. And there's a couple things to keep in mind of why I don't think that GameCube is ever really going to play on this device. Number one is that it uses the RetroArch Dolphin core. And this core just does not compare to the standalone Dolphin emulator that you might be familiar with. And honestly, I just don't think this chip is ever going to be able to handle GameCube. For the most part, I was able to start up a lot of GameCube games, but I would say within the first 2 or 3 minutes, the game would just straight up freeze. So while this device can probably do Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and even some PSP really well, I would just not add GameCube into that equation. So wrapping things up here, who do I really think this device is going to appeal to? Well, I think there's 4 different types of people who will really enjoy this. The first are going to be the DIYers. If the idea of taking an original Game Boy Advance and making some holes in it and putting it together with this kit is exciting to you, then I think you'll really enjoy this, because it seems to be a really nice kit. And then also, if you're a tinkerer, if you're someone who likes the idea of having 5 different firmwares available, and then testing all of them out and seeing which one works best, if all that sounds fun to you, then you're probably going to enjoy playing around with this system. And number 3, I think that collectors are going to enjoy this too, because this is a handmade, one-of-a-kind system, and it has some pretty ingenious ideas inside of it. And so in that case, I do think it is pretty cool. And finally, if you're one of those people who had the original Game Boy Advance and you really loved it, when you pick up this device for the first time, you're probably going to get a flood of emotions. Because nothing really beats that moment when you pick up some original hardware that's been optimized for today's settings, and all of a sudden it works way better than the original ever did. And obviously that experience might not be for everyone, but if it is for you, then this might be worth considering. Okay, so who should avoid this device? Again, I think there are 4 types of people who might want to hear this. The first are going to be people who are perfectionists, either aesthetically or software-wise. Because the fact that this is a handmade device, it's going to have some imperfections to it. So if you're looking for like a perfect machine-crafted device, this is definitely not that. next to those people who were really obsessed with getting perfect performance. As much as this hardware is more powerful than, say, the RK3326 devices, this is not like a next generation leap. I don't think this device is ever going to be capable of perfect Nintendo 64 or PSP. It's going to play a lot of these games really well, but you're not going to see full speed for everything. Now, almost every day I get emails from people who say that they're not a PC person or they're not a computer person, but they need help. If you're one of those people who identify with not being a computer person, you're not going to enjoy this device, because it does take a good amount of tweaking just to get working in the first place. So if you're the type of person who really enjoys this idea of pick up and play gameplay, I would steer clear of this device. And finally, if you have really big hands, you're not going to enjoy this device either. Because in addition to being a relatively small device, the extra buttons that they've added make it feel even more compact. I have medium-sized hands, and I can't imagine playing this device if it was any smaller than it is right now. So yeah, that's my list here. Who I think would enjoy this device, and who I think would not enjoy it. Personally, I'm having a lot of fun with this device. It's been fun to play around with the firmware and talk to the developers and see what other tweaks we can make. And I just get a kick out of the idea of playing Nintendo 64 games on this device in the first place. And sure, it doesn't play every Nintendo 64 game perfectly, but for me, just the fact that it plays them on original hardware like this kind of helps me overcome some of those shortcomings. I kind of think of this device as a Game Boy Advance on steroids. Sure, it's going to play Game Boy Advance games perfectly as expected, but the moment I turn on a Dreamcast or PSP or Nintendo 64 game, this device gets infinitely cooler in my mind. And if that concept is kind of cool to you as well, then it might be worth checking out that Kickstarter campaign. As of making this video, it has something like 17 or 18 days left. And I do think the going rate of $167 for the pre-built device is actually a pretty good deal. It's really not that more expensive than something like the RG351V, but once the firmware is optimized, I think the performance on this is going to be significantly better. That being said, if you're all about the performance, then I would say maybe look into spending $200 with the next generation of handheld devices like the Odin Lite or the upcoming RG552. But really, this device is not meant to compete with those in any way. This is literally a Game Boy Advance on steroids. And so I think in that frame of reference, this is kind of a timeless handheld. It's something that's going to be cool even 5 years from now. And I can't really say the same about some of the other devices that are around today. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found that helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.